Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the introduction to the Inclusive Pedagogy Toolkit webinar. This webinar is hosted by the ACRL's Instruction Section's Pedagogy Committee, which creates opportunities for instruction librarians to learn more about inclusive, anti-oppressive pedagogy, and then implement these teaching practices into their academic context. I am your MC for the day, Darlene Aguilar, and I am a member of the Inclusive Pedagogies Committee. So before we begin, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Attendees are encouraged to submit their questions at the end during the Q&A. And in this webinar, you're going to learn how to use the ACRL's Instruction Section's Inclusive Pedagogies Toolkit to examine, reflect on, and to mitigate personal bias in instructional library settings to create an inclusive practice. The creators of the toolkit will walk participants through a general understanding of inclusive pedagogy, the deliberate scaffolding of the toolkit, and applicable tools for instruction that will prompt participants to think critically about their own classrooms and instructional interactions. So let me introduce today's presenters. Marikeet Fain, she, her. Marikeet is an archives coordinator and liaison librarian to the College of Business at John Brown University in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. Professionally, Marikeet is involved in the Diversity Committee at JBU and has been involved in multiple digital initiatives on campus. Working with students is one of Marikeet's favorite parts of working at a university, from mentoring student workers to serving as the employee sponsor for multiple student groups. In her personal life, Marikeet has a deep love for sci-fi and fantasy and loves the upcoming generation of nerds that they'll have an easier time finding themselves represented in stories than she ever did growing up. Ramon Garcia, he, him. Ramon is currently a Learning Commons librarian at Dallas College. In his role, he focuses on delivering library instruction and outreach to traditionally underserved students. A previous librarian resident, he is also an ALA Emergence Leader, ALA Spectrum Scholar, and an ARL Kaleidoscope Scholar. When not in the library, he enjoys long hikes, going to the movies, spending time with his cats, Chewy and Hubie. Alexandra Howard, pronouns she, her. Alex is the business and entrepreneurship librarian, engaged learning coordinator, and a tenure-track faculty at the University of Louisville Libraries. She strives to work at the intersection of anti-racism and community engagement. Her research focuses on developing opportunities for community-engaged research that utilize library and university resources to respond to local inequities and promote community empowerment. Nadia Orozco Sahi, pronouns she, they. Nadia is a queer person of color and first-generation American, currently working as a library information specialist at the University of New Mexico, which sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. In addition to their compulsive reading, they are a wife and a mother, a lifelong morning person, a musician, and a firm observer of a 4 o'clock tea time. Danica White, pronouns she, her. As the coordinator of undergraduate research and engagement at Penn State University Libraries, Danica focuses on outreach initiatives and programming that promote academic success and lifelong learning for Penn State students. Danica collaborates with the campus partners to coordinate undergraduate research support and provides leadership for student engagement strategies and initiatives that enhance knowledge and use of library services. Her research interests include diversity and social justice, information access in academic libraries, undergraduate research, and engagement with student organizations. Thank you to all of them for being here today and sharing their expertise. Take it away, presenters.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us, for attending this session. We want to say thank you to Yen for inviting us, Darlene for moderating, and the instruction section of this group for sponsoring this project to begin with. When we all started our Emerging Leaders Project year, we got to pick which project kind of spoke to us that we wanted to work on. It threw the 5 of us together, and it has been an amazing experience, not just putting this together, but just working as a cohort to put this together for you. So thank you all for that. This toolkit was assembled over 3 years by 2 classes of the Emerging Leader Program, and it was completed in June 2022 by the 5 of us. It is now maintained solely by the Instruction Section of the ACRL. It was a project that was built upon looking at a survey at the need for supporting diversity and inclusion within instruction programs and within the instruction section itself. It was conducted and analyzed by the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force alongside the previous class of emerging leaders. And that report recommended the creation of a LibGuide to address the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion by pulling together online resources, tools, and best practices related to inclusive pedagogy for academic instruction librarians and the broader library community. Really, we wanted it to be accessible to everybody. So that's what we're going to be sharing with you today, the final product, and some of the things that we want to highlight from the LibGuide, how it functions, and how best to use it. So we're going to start with a little bit more of introductions, and we just went through a lot of introductions. Stick with us here, hopefully it pays off. So you heard my name is Nadia, my pronouns are they, she. I'm a queer person of color and first-generation American. My fullest name is Nadia Mira Orozco Sahi. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story of my fullest name. And while I'm doing that, if you want to consider the story of your fullest names, some of the questions that you're seeing on the screen, feel free to share in the chat if you'd like, or just think through it as I'm going through this here. So my full name, Nadia Mira Orozco Sahi, is a name that constantly confounds people. On the phone, my answer is, this is Nadia. And I often receive a, oh, hello, Maria, in reply, as though I'm mispronouncing my own name. When I lived in Michigan for a while, I'd be called over the loudspeaker at school as Nadia Say Hi. So it really throws people. I am English-Spanish bilingual, and my name previous to marriage was just Sahi. People would not believe that I spoke Spanish. Now with the Orozco attached, people don't believe that I'm Nadia because I don't look Hispanic. So they're always looking for that other Nadia that they're sure they talk to. For those of you who do speak Spanish, you know my name is very close to being nobody, nadie, or nothing, nada. I've taken a lot of Spanish classes through formal education. This is always brought up. My parents, mostly my mother, named me Nadia after Comenici, the Romanian gymnast who received the first perfect 10 in the Olympic gymnastics at age 14. So if names hold our expectations, that was a big one to hold. Nadia is a Russian name for hope, unless I'm around brown people. And then it's an Arabic or Hindu name for delicate. My middle name is Mira because Nadia wasn't sufficiently Indian enough for my father's parents, who weren't thrilled that my father married, excuse me, a non-Indian. So Mira was the name that was meant to placate that side of the family. In Spanish, Mira also means look. So in Spanish, my name can be mistaken for nobody looks or look, nothing. So that's a little bit of the story of my fullest name. And the reason that we wanted to start with that is we want you to think about yours too. Considering who named you, why did they choose your name? Do you know the ethnic origins? Again, if you feel comfortable, share in the chat, and Market is going to tell you kind of why we're starting with this.
So like Nadia said, why are we asking you to think about this? Why are we starting a session on inclusive pedagogy talking about names? Firstly, we know that naming is important, and that includes personal names, nicknames chosen or changed or altered names. They help us to situate ourselves. But we also wanted to start the session off with some self-reflection, because that's one of the guiding principles of this entire toolkit and this work. The ability to self-reflect, to recognize where you're situated and to move forward from that positionality. So each of the sections that we're going to talk about has space built into the LibGuide to stop and reflect. It's not just go, 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 go and do the work and follow a form and check boxes off. So we wanted to help you get into that mindset. So the very first page of the LibGuide will help you do that. It has resources you might be familiar with, like the Flower of Power, the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, but also just some reflection questions about your personal circles, guidance for forming community communities of practice and critical friend groups that can help support you. And other thing we know about names is they change. Words develop new meanings, and inclusive pedagogy is no different. That has actually done a lot of evolving, and it continues to do so. And Danica is going to walk us through a brief history of inclusive pedagogy's history.
Thank you. So yeah, let's begin with the history of inclusive education. So the idea of inclusive education first emerged from a long period of activism in the 1960s and 1970s, but it didn't appear in the research literature until the late 1980s. And it was first discussed as part of disability justice advocacy and a desire for students with disabilities to have access to mainstream educational resources. So inclusive education eventually expanded to include access, participation, and opportunities to learn for other marginalized student populations. And this philosophy was later extended to all forms of human diversity with the view that all students should have opportunities to participate in education. And this focused particularly on areas where learners are marginalized by race, gender, class, ability, socioeconomic status, and sexuality. Now, in higher education, the term inclusive pedagogy was introduced by Frank Tuitt in 2003, and Tuitt considered 5 components to inclusive pedagogy. 1, faculty-student interaction. 2, sharing power. 3, dialogical professor-student interaction. 4, activation of student voice. And 5, utilization of personal narratives. Inclusive pedagogy and information literacy in library instruction is related to questioning and dismantling dominant knowledge systems that have long excluded and marginalized certain learners. Now, let's talk about definitions of inclusive pedagogy a little bit. So in their 2015 article, which is titled Exploring Inclusive Pedagogy, Lonnie Florian and Christine Black Hawkins said, quote, inclusive pedagogy is underpinned by a shift in pedagogical thinking from an approach that works for most learners, existing alongside something additional or different for those who experience difficulties, towards one that involves providing rich learning opportunities that are sufficiently made available for everyone so that all learners are able to participate in classroom life, unquote. So when creating this toolkit, we wanted to make sure that our definition of inclusive pedagogy aligned with the resources we were sharing and moved from a deficit approach, like we saw in the early years of inclusive education, to a more diversity approach. So we spent a lot of time reading definitions, not just of inclusive pedagogy, but also of critical pedagogy, of feminist pedagogy, and liberatory pedagogy. Because these all live in the same family. We also turned to texts and ideas of Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, Kimberly Crenshaw. We looked at cultural humility, active learning, and many, many others. Now, let's get into our definition of inclusive pedagogy for this toolkit. So inclusive pedagogy is defined by this guide as an instructional pedagogy, meaning it's about action. It's concerned with making learning materials and teaching methods accessible to as many students as possible by considering a range of diverse student identities, including race, gender, sexuality, and abilities, and centering these diverse identities in developing educational practices. And there's a quote at the top of each of our LibGuide pages, and this kind of serves as kind of a palate cleanser to the deeper work happening in the guide. So at the top of our page with the definition is a quote, diversity is a fact, inclusion is an act. And this guide and the definition is primarily, again, about action. So at the bottom of that same page, you'll see some options for additional reading. And those bottom of the page resources are going to be for people who are seeking a deeper dive into some of these concepts. But you might not be in a place where you want or even have the capacity for doing a deeper dive, and we totally get it. We totally understand. This is about the process, again, the action and moving through it. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it along for how to use the guide.
All right. So how to use this guide? Take it from the top. We designed this toolkit in order to scaffold knowledge as you work your way through it. So while you can go in and click through the different tabs and kind of look at what there is and what we have, we really designed it in a way that you start on the first page and you can kind of work through, and things are going to continue building on each other. So our hope was in building this guide was that it could serve individuals coming to it from different places. Like Danica mentioned, everybody's going to be at a different starting point and how ready they are to dive in and do the work. And for some people, this may be sort of the very first place they start and just kind of learning it. So there should be something to help begin building the self-awareness and knowledge to implement inclusive pedagogy, no matter what your starting point is. The work at the beginning, when we're on the very first tabs, it's personal, reflective, and it's for you to have a foundation on which to build an inclusive practice. We started there because doing inclusive pedagogy on a surface level, like I said earlier, just having boxes you can check off, it isn't likely to bring the full benefits into the classroom or instructional sections, and actually has the potential to do more harm when you haven't put the work in behind it to really believe in what you're doing and why, and when you're going to get pushback from the people that you're working with. So having a why, which is going to keep bringing you back to this work when it's hard, that's the personal conviction, a belief in studies that show that inclusive pedagogy improves learning outcomes. Maybe it's an attempt at learning something new and trying something new because what you're doing isn't working, or maybe it's coming as a push from above. Somebody in administration thinks inclusive pedagogy is the new hot thing and they want everybody to implement it into their classrooms and instruction sessions. All of those are valid reasons to look into and pursue inclusive pedagogy. None of them make the work easier to do or redo what it is that you're going to be working on. And because of that, we really want you all to have support as you're going through this process. So figuring out who are your people, if possible. You'd want people at your institution, in your department, who understand the work and the culture that you're dealing with. But not all of us are going to find ourselves in a situation where our coworkers or our directors are necessarily supportive of our endeavors. So maybe there's somebody else from your institution, but in another department, or maybe finding support from colleagues at other institutions. They may not understand the exact specifics the same way a coworker would, but on some level, academia is academia and librarianship is librarianship. And we can all be there to help support each other as we work through things like this. You also need people in your life outside of work who know you more fully than just as an employee or a coworker or a mentee or a mentor. Because I know when I'm at work, I put on my game face, and life outside of work suffers when all of those emotions finally spill out because I don't feel like I can fully express them at work, maybe when I'm frustrated at a situation. So overhauling a course, a syllabus, or even in a single instructional session can be taxing and overwhelming. So having somebody in your life to help you keep and stay in your own healthy boundaries, which does include being pushed outside of your comfort zones, but still maintaining those healthy boundaries. It's going to help you be able to see those projects through to completion. And then finally, you need to be willing to listen. If we're going to learn to use inclusive pedagogy effectively, we need to do more than just simply learn about it. Like we said, it's an act. It's the act of doing it. There's a time for reflection, but then you have to put it into action. And part of that is we need to be willing to listen and learn from others. So everyone brings their own viewpoints to the table, and it does take intentionality to stretch yourself beyond what you know. I was homeschooled K through 12 with my sister. We spent pretty much as much time as two people could be experiencing the same things. Yet today we look back very differently at those experiences because we're two very different people. We had different things that colored those situations. So if we imagined life so differently, imagine how that scales for each new difference you add: socioeconomics, culture, neurovariance, religion, gender, age, sexuality. The list is wide, and inclusive pedagogy seeks to include everyone at the same level. It's in the name, inclusive pedagogy. So this goes beyond just saying, I have a neighbor, I have a friend, I have a student, I have a coworker. It's putting in the effort to educate yourself. It's taking the time to listen and learn from the diverse voices in your life, and not just putting that all on maybe that friend or that neighbor or that coworker that you do have, but going out and seeking people who are already using their voice and speaking out their experiences for people to learn from. So that could be books, social media, podcast. This toolkit itself was created using inclusion criteria that look to center diverse voices, diverse types of material, and open source material so that it could benefit a wider audience. And then in order to actually learn from what we're taking in, you can't just read the book or listen to the podcast. We need to listen with an intent to hear, not to respond. And so, we've told our students sometimes, go on something like Twitter and find 10 people of color in your particular field that you're studying and follow them. Not to respond, just to listen, to hear what they have to say, to hear their part of the conversation. So by letting ourselves sit with what we hear, even when it's uncomfortable or we struggle to understand that other perspective, we're giving ourselves a chance to grow in empathy and understanding, and then be able to ask better questions, be able to engage more fully in conversations, and be able to be better instructors. So now that we've unpacked sort of the first step of the LibGuide, Alex is going to take us into some of the practical doing sections.
Great. So our next section of the toolkit are tools for instruction. So this is really the meatiest section of the toolkit. We mentioned earlier that we wanted the toolkit to have a bit of a scaffolded structure, building towards understanding and implementation. So the tools for instruction section, while it still has those elements of reflection, of providing some critical feedback to the work, it also has all the links, which is really what we're used to seeing in LibGuides. So while lots of these resources that are included were created for a traditional classroom setting, they can be adapted to be used in one-shot instruction sessions and credit courses, research appointments, and in other types of library instruction. And in fact, some of the resources deal specifically with virtual settings, since more and more that's where these kinds of interactions are happening. So the tools for instruction really move us from the theoretical understandings of inclusive pedagogy to the practice of inclusive pedagogy. So we have the tools for instruction organized into 4 different categories, and those are tools for self-reflection and implicit bias, sample lessons and tutorials, universal design, and classroom engagement. So the tools are organized by category into separate Padlets. And by hosting these resources on Padlet, there's an opportunity to update the resources and for anyone using the toolkit to suggest additional resources. So as you're navigating the Padlet, you can just click the plus sign on the Padlet page to add a post, add in the information and the link to the resource, and then it will be submitted to the ACRL Instruction Session for approval. So Ramon is now going to walk us through these 4 different categories of tools for instruction.
All right, thank you, Alex. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with the self-reflection section. So this section about self-reflection and implicit bias contains a number of tools for you to be able to work through both personally and as you prepare for instruction. And I just want to highlight a few of them to give you an idea of what you can find here. So for self-reflection, we found the Sewanee University Library's Inclusive Pedagogy for Library Instruction Guide extremely helpful in our own self-reflection. It included a pre-class and post-class instructor reflection worksheets that are excellent guides for self-reflection. It also includes suggestions for best practices, as well as spaces to reflect both before and after a class. So with implicit bias, we've included both articles for reading on the topic, as well as links to more interactive assessments to help you learn more about where you're currently coming from at this point in your life. So I think about these assessments as helping to highlight my blind spots, those things that I don't even realize are problematic because I don't realize that I'm doing them. So from there, we move on to sample lessons and tutorials. So here's where we find the bulk of the checklist resources. So how to design an inclusive syllabus, assignment, or instructional materials. Checklists and samples can be great, but they can also hinder the creative process a little bit. And that's something that we want to caution against. Once you've done some of the things presented in the beginning of this toolkit, adapting the tools that you've already used and know well is going to get a lot easier. So please take a look at these. If you're a person who really benefits from starting a task with specific goals in mind, these are going to serve you really well. And if you're not, it's worth taking a look at them to give you other ideas, maybe to remind you of something you'd forgotten or hadn't thought about yet, like what inclusive office hours might look like and how that's communicated on a syllabus. So from there, we're moving on to universal design. So nothing in the guide exists in a vacuum. And as we spent our time looking for resources that include in the toolkit, it was a very natural fit to include universal design as a tool. So one worksheet in particular in the toolkit was created by Dr. Lindsay Bernhag, the director for the Center of Inclusive Teaching and Learning at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. While the focus of the checklist is incorporating universal design into a semester-long class, it can easily be adopted into a one-shot instruction session, as well as providing guidance that may be used in research appointments or at the reference desk. So the checklist provides specific ideas and activities in 7 major categories that instructors can use to ensure their instruction is inclusive and accommodates the needs and abilities of all learners. So just for example, considering learner diversity, offering student options for demonstrating knowledge, and promoting collaboration in the classroom are just a couple of examples of, yeah, thank you. So then we move on to classroom engagement. So our last tab in the tools for instruction resource box is classroom engagement. So classroom engagement differs from the sample lessons and tutorials in that these are activities, strategies, and resources that are not about content, but about building relationships, which help to break down the barriers that exist between instructors and students. None of these guides are going to recommend that you commiserate over students' sick pets or know the names of all of their siblings. We're talking about knowing that your students are more than students, right? That there are whole persons outside of your instructional interactions. You're all here as library educators, but you're also tennis players, bakers, musicians. So if I'm teaching a class, for example, on effectively searching a particular database and I'm talking about keywords, tennis players may be able to offer their experience of being confused at first over what love means in a tennis game. And that's a great example of needing contextual clues and subject terms to narrow a field, or bakers will make connections between that content and substituting some ingredients for others. But the main thing is that you're allowing people to come to these interactions as a whole person with insight, with knowledge, maybe not about the particular thing that you're helping them with, but knowledge that is relevant nonetheless. And this is what's going to drive engagement. The resources that you're going to see in this section of the LibGuide are ways to step outside of the student-teacher binary and learn from each other. So for example, the Fullest name activity that we started with, you're going to see that in a few of these resources because it lets you know, it lets you get to know someone in a different way, but lets you have a classroom where people feel comfortable being who they are as much as they're willing to share. And it doesn't mean that you do the Fullest name activity and learn that Marikit's name means something in Tagalog. So you look up something from the Philippines, including your demonstration. You're not going to perfectly represent every student. It's impossible. It's an impossible task, but you can provide enough diversity of representation that it lets people know that it's okay to share and teach from those differences. So I want to highlight those 10 best practices from one of the resources in the classroom engagement section from the Association of College and University Educators. The thing we like most about this resource is that every one of these practices comes with a video, a description, and a link to a document that supports your efforts in these areas. In keeping with the idea of UDL that we touched on earlier, the guide provides multiple options for engagement. The fact is that if you're actively creating an inclusive environment, you will have classroom engagement. Having these things established ensures that students feel comfortable engaging, sharing their own experiences, and making the learning work for them rather than just doing the work. So some of those things that instructors can do to create such a setting include using inclusive language, using interest surveys to connect with students, and valuing diverse viewpoints. So now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Alex.
Great. So we wanted to talk about a section of the guide that's under our tools for instruction that we decided was very important to include in this Inclusive Pedagogy Toolkit. So we really wanted to dedicate an entire page of the toolkit to anti-racism and anti-racist pedagogy. While anti-racism work has always been important, there's no denying the shift in public consciousness that occurred in the 3 years that the Inclusive Pedagogy Toolkit was being created, both by our Emerging Leaders group and the group from the previous cohort. As our country finally began to publicly reckon with its centuries-long racism pandemic due to the pattern of Black citizens being murdered by police officers, an increased focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism emerged across institutions of higher education and within the field of librarianship. So we thought it was beneficial to dedicate a section of the toolkit to anti-racism to support librarians in developing a deeper understanding and engagement with the topic by collating a variety of different resources on the matter. So the resources in this section seek to provide a basis for understanding anti-racism in instructional settings, offer ways to move towards anti-racism in classrooms and student interactions, and support the work of incorporating anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices as part of a successful and meaningful inclusive pedagogy. So the section of the toolkit contains a variety of resources, from videos to scholarly articles, to podcasts, to more rubrics and checklists. But one resource I'd like to be sure to highlight and encourage you all to download for free is the Anti-Racist Discussion Pedagogy. So you can request a free copy of the guide from a link that's in the toolkit, and we can also share that in the chat. So the guide is a theoretical and a practical tool for building an anti-racist pedagogy in any discipline. So this guide includes self-reflection questions for instructors, a template for class communication standards, discussion prompts to guide anti-racist reflective discussion in the classroom, as well as recommendations for course design. So I'd like to end our introduction of the anti-racism section of the Inclusive Pedagogy Toolkit by sharing the self-reflection prompts for instructors that are found in this anti-racist discussion pedagogy. So as I share them, I invite you to reflect on your answers to the questions and continue to consider your response to these questions as you move forward to adopting inclusive pedagogy in your instruction. So the first question is, am I ready to do this work even when it becomes uncomfortable? The second is, have I learned enough to confidently support this conversation? The third is, how has my own experience shaped my perspective and biases? The fourth is, am I ready to facilitate rather than dictate? And the fifth is, how will I handle potentially challenging scenarios? So I will now turn it over to Danica to discuss the self-care section of this toolkit.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex. So we are at the last section of the LibGuide, which is self-care. And we start the section with a quote by Ava DuVernay. And it is, "Too much of not caring for yourself is not a good thing. We're bad at that as achievers. Self-care is a priority and we have to do it more." And I think many of us can relate to that. Sometimes, we're not spending the time we need to care for ourselves. And that's why we decided to add the section. So there is a 2015 study titled "Racism as a Determinant of Health." And this study suggests the daily stress of dealing with discrimination, systemic racism, prejudice, the additional energy that is often expended to advance in professional settings, and the burden of just juggling all of these things alongside responsibilities in the home and within relationships, can really take a toll on the overall health of people in communities of color. So we decided to dedicate a section of the toolkit to self-care because while this work is important and impactful, it's definitely not easy. Self-care is not always highlighted within BIPOC communities. However, self-care and prioritizing yourself can be a powerful mental health tool for fostering mental well-being. So in this section, you will find ways that we can support ourselves and each other through this difficult work. And in the section, you're going to find different library guides that talk about self-care, different websites, supportive groups to join, different apps, BIPOC library organizations, and various podcasts. And these resources can be used inside and outside of education, and they are specifically for and by people of color who often bear the brunt of emotional labor when these topics are discussed. So I did want to quickly do a shout out for a podcast that I think is really great. If you haven't heard about it, Lib Voices. I listen on Spotify, but they talk a lot about self-care. So with that, I will go ahead and pass it back to Alex.
Great, thanks, Danica. So that's the content we had prepared for you guys to introduce the toolkit. We really appreciate you joining us. We hope that we've been able to equip you with the understanding you need to use the Inclusive Pedagogy Toolkit as you move forward with your work. So at this time, we invite you to share any questions you have for us or any comments. Kind of looking through the chat now. I see Andy mentioned being from one of the states trying to make this harder to teach, and I'm from Tennessee and live in Kentucky, so I totally understand and resonate with that.
Just while you guys are thinking through it, I know we threw a lot of stuff at you really quickly there. I also wanted to mention that the scaffolding process that we used in the LibGuide, so that having content and then a piece for reflection and then kind of a deeper dive if you want to go there, that was all laid out by Jen Bonnet. So we contacted her about kind of using her system of scaffolding those difficult conversations, and she gave us permission to use that kind of a place to start the work, and then knowing that not everybody is going to want to read the 6 things that are recommended, just giving the option, leaving that there and not making it a huge part of the guide is like overloading you with resources. So that kind of self-reflective process of it, we thank Jen Bonnet for that format.
I also just wanted to point out that on the LibGuide, when you're going through it, the way we set it up, we use Padlet. So if you have any other resources that you're familiar with that you think would be a really good fit, there's actually ways for you to add notes, and then the ACRL IS can see what people are recommending. You can upvote the resources that you've found really helpful, because we did this research a year ago. There may be new things that have come out since then. There may be things that we just never came across. It was 5 of us versus the internet. So I'm sure we missed some great sources out there. So we would love if you could continue sharing sources with the instruction section so that they can help keep it updated with really relevant and useful resources.
And since we aren't getting any questions right now, I'll answer a question that maybe we anticipated or just share something that we noticed in doing the work together. And that's where there's gaps with inclusive pedagogy. So we did a lot of research. There's a lot of great resources out there, but we did notice a gap in using inclusive pedagogy and reference instruction. So we thought that was really interesting. We, tried to find any literature on it or any examples of how to do that. And we definitely noticed that for our profession, there was a gap in how you kind of apply these principles of inclusive pedagogy into reference work. So if anyone knows of sources maybe we missed, please feel free to drop those in the chat. Or if anybody wants to do that research and do that work, I think it would be great for us as a library profession to have that guiding principle.
So it looks like most of our attendees just can't wait to get in and dig in more to the actual content and learn more from there. They're all very excited. Oh, and will the slides be shared with the registrants?
I can certainly make these slides public. Yes. Is that something, Darlene or Yen, that I would send to you and you could send to? I see Yen is saying the recording will be shared.
Probably.
I'm happy to share the slides as well.
Send it to Yen, yeah.
Well, hopefully you all don't mind that we ended a little early on a Friday afternoon. I really appreciate you guys all coming out and joining us, sharing your Friday afternoon with us.
I had a question. It says, are you aware of sources related to inclusive pedagogy as a concept and practice in relation to age/generation of the instructor? That was from Debbie. It was just a direct message.
Thanks for the question, Debbie. So a lot of these guides and the resources that we found don't deal specifically with one area, right? So they're not talking about inclusive pedagogy as it relates to race or as it relates to ethnicity or as it relates to language. It's taking the view that by breaking down some of the structures that exist between instructors and students, some of those barriers, it helps to create an environment where everyone feels a little more comfortable sharing from their experience. Age, sex are definitely things that are touched on in those guides, but we don't have anything that I'm aware of, like resource-wise, that speaks to specifically to that issue, but rather how to have that be one of the areas in which you are providing an inclusive setting, if that makes sense. Or if you'd like to speak more on that, Debbie, we're happy to. I don't know if that quite answered your question, but so nothing that deals specifically with age, but resources that do mention it as one of the facets that are considered within inclusive pedagogy.
Follow-up. I find that my passion for the topic is very different from my younger colleagues. It seems self-evident to me, but hard to learn later in my life. That's from Debbie again.
Thanks for that, Debbie. Yeah, I can certainly see how, we do have people coming at this from lots of different places, and even in thinking about inclusive pedagogy in different ways. And that can be an age thing, that can be an ethnicity thing. One of the things that I bumped on is that inclusive pedagogy, we've talked about how it's about breaking down barriers, right? We want it to be some kind of
call back in like 20 minutes.
Communal learning. And as part of that, like there is not a lot of discussion. We did include, I think, one resource, but discussion about how that can impact an instructor who is a person of color, or an instructor who perhaps inherently has less power already. And then how do you mitigate that, right? If you're saying giving more power to students, what does that mean for you when you might already have less power based on your positionality? So there are lots of different ways to come at how to implement this, what the best practice for you might be. And we really tried to include as much as possible that would talk about all of these different facets to help you work through it, because every situation is different, every interaction with the student is different. And thank you for sharing your experience. I think everyone comes at it from somewhere different. And that was why we built so much self-reflection kind of into the guide, because we know that I can't speak for everybody's experience in an instructional setting. Danica can't, Ramon can't, Alex can't, none of us, Marika, none of us are having a universal learning experience. And so what does it mean to be inclusive universally? And it's going to depend.
And I will say, I'm the old soul on the team that helped put this together. I may not necessarily look it. I think my Asian Filipino genes for that. But I find that a lot of times when I'm working with my students, I'm not in a teaching section right now. I do work on the reference desk in the library, but I supervise 9 students in my department here in archives and working on a publication team. And it's an interesting dynamic to see how I work through things versus how they work through things, because I think there's a lot of things that they grew up just as a part of their conversations. They're just a part of their everyday vernacular. And they're things that I didn't start talking about until I was nearly middle-aged. And it's like, okay, now I need to, I want to do this work, but I'm having to relearn how I'm thinking about all of this. I'm having to unlearn and then relearn. So it's like, in some ways, I feel like it puts the individuals that I'm around, whether it's the students or coworkers who are younger than me, they have an advantage almost. Sometimes it feels like where they've been having those conversations for so long now. But I've also come to realize that because I'm having to really wrestle with those concepts more and unpack it, that as I work through it, when I'm getting towards the end, I feel like I have a deeper, more nuanced understanding of what I think, what I believe, why I think it's important. And so it's harder to get to that point. But I feel like I actually reach a more sustainable point in that conversation when I get there. And I tell all my students all the time, I say, I never want to be someone who reaches a point where I think I know the answer to everything, because I'm pretty sure on that day, I'm going to be absolutely wrong about everything. So I always tell them, I'm going to be on this journey for the rest of my life. I'm going to be learning. I'm going to be working through it. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I love the enthusiasm and the passion of the Gen Zers in my life, but they sometimes run themselves out real fast and then don't know where to go from there.
Great. So if there are no more questions, we'll wrap it up. I do want to give a huge thanks to all the presenters, Marikit, Ramon, Alexandria, Nadia, and Danica. And thank you all for attending. And I hope you're taking away some useful tools for providing a more inclusive classroom. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thanks, y'all.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you, everybody.